The chalk snapped in Harriet Ellsworth's hand the moment the schoolhouse door banged open hard enough to rattle the window panes, and 11 children turned as one to see Tommy Doyle standing in the frame, hatless, his shirt torn at the shoulder, gasping so hard he could barely form words. "Miss Ellsworth! Miss Ellsworth, they are burning the bridge. I saw men with axes and torches. My pa sent me to fetch help. They are cutting the ropes at Carver Crossing right now." Harriet set down the ruined chalk and crossed the room in 4 quick strides, catching the boy by the shoulders before his trembling legs gave out. He could not have been more than 10 years old, and his eyes were wide and glassy with the particular terror that belonged only to children who had just seen something meant for grown men. "Who was cutting it, Tommy? Did you see faces?" "Big men. Riding for Mr. Kingston, I think, on account of one of them wore that black coat with the silver buttons like his foreman does. My pa told me to run and not stop." Before she could ask another question, the door swung open a second time, and this new arrival nearly fell across the threshold. It was Otis Reed, the ferry operator, his left arm wrapped in a bloodied kerchief, his face pale as creek foam. The children gasped and scattered toward the back wall. "Miss Ellsworth," Otis said, breathing hard, "do not let that boy scare the whole valley. There was no men with torches. It was the spring flood water, finally took the weak span out from underneath, same as I told the mayor it would 2 years running. I cut my arm trying to save the plank decking. That is the whole of it. An accident, nothing more." Harriet looked from the terrified boy to the injured ferryman, and something cold and clear settled behind her ribs. The same feeling she used to get in a Denver newsroom when 2 witnesses to the same fire gave 2 different accounts of where it started. One of these men was lying, and she intended to find out which one, and why. She was 27 years old, and for 4 months now she had been Miss Harriet Ellsworth, schoolteacher of Sable Canyon, Colorado, hired hastily after the previous teacher fled town in the night without so much as a note of resignation. What the town did not know, what she had told no one save her editor back in Gunnison, was that she had also once been Harriet Ellsworth, correspondent for the Rocky Mountain Sentinel, writing under the byline H.E. Wells because no editor in the territory would trust a woman's name atop a hard news column. She had come to Sable Canyon chasing a rumor that would not die, that the Kingston Land and Cattle Company was buying up homestead claims through the valley with deeds that did not hold up to close examination, and that men who asked too many questions about those deeds had a habit of disappearing, the way Tommy Doyle's own father, Ezra, very nearly had before he was found 3 days later half-starved in a dry wash, refusing to say what happened. She told the children to stay put and mind their reading, gathered her shawl and her small leather satchel, and walked Tommy and Otis both out onto the schoolhouse steps, into the gold light of a Colorado summer afternoon that seemed far too calm for the fear still clinging to the boy's face. "I'm going to see that bridge myself," she said. "Otis, you go find Doc Bennett for that arm. Tommy, you come with me partway and show me exactly where your father is." It was not 200 yards down the canyon road that she nearly collided with a rider coming the other way at a hard trot, a broad-shouldered man on a rangy bay gelding, his hat low against the sun, a coiled lariat slapping his saddle horn with every stride. He hauled back on the reins so sharply that dust rose in a pale curtain between them. "Miss Ellsworth." Jasper Carver touched his hat brim, though his eyes were already scanning past her toward the canyon rim, toward the direction of the crossing. "You are headed the wrong way if you are running from trouble." "I am not running from anything, Mr. Carver. I am walking toward it same as you, unless I am mistaken about where you are headed." He looked down at her for a long moment, and something like reluctant respect crossed his weathered face. Jasper Carver was 32 years old, and the whole valley knew him as the quiet man who kept to his homestead at the mouth of the canyon, who had buried a wife 2 summers past and had not danced at a social since, who answered greetings with a nod more often than words. His father had strung the first rope and plank bridge across the Sable River 40 years before, back when this whole valley was still considered too rough for anyone but trappers and fools, and Jasper still held the deed to the land on both banks where the crossing stood. "I got word my crossing is being torn apart," he said. "Figured I would see for myself instead of trusting the first story that reached me." "Funny thing about that," Harriet said, falling into step beside his horse as he walked it slowly forward to match her pace. "I got 2 stories inside of 5 minutes, and they cannot both be true. A boy tells me armed men with torches are cutting your bridge apart. A man with a fresh wound tells me it was nothing but spring floodwater and an accident. Someone is lying to somebody, Mr. Carver, and I intend to find out who." "That sounds like a schoolteacher's curiosity." "It sounds like good sense," she said, and did not elaborate further, though she felt his gaze linger on her a moment longer than the words required. They reached the crossing within the half-hour, Harriet walking briskly enough that Jasper finally offered her a hand up behind his saddle, rather than watch her half run the last quarter-mile, an offer she accepted with more grace than either of them expected, given how little they knew of each other beyond passing nods after Sunday service. What they found at Carver Crossing put an end to both stories Harriet had been told that afternoon, and confirmed her worst suspicion in the same breath. The rope suspension lines had not snapped from age or flood water. They had been cut, cleanly, with an axe or a heavy knife, the fibers sheared through in a pattern no river current could produce. Half the plank decking lay shattered on the rocks 50 feet below, and gouged into the support post nearest the western bank. Someone had left a boot print pressed deep into churned mud, alongside a scrap of paper caught on a splinter of wood, a torn corner of a printed form bearing, unmistakably, the embossed seal of the Kingston Land and Cattle Company. Jasper crouched beside the ruined post, running his thumb along the axe marks with the particular stillness of a man holding down a much larger anger. "My father built this bridge with his own hands the year before I was born," he said quietly. "Cattle crossed it, wagons crossed it, my mother's coffin crossed it on the way to the church." This was no flood. Harriet knelt beside him and carefully worked the torn paper free of the splinter, tucking it into her satchel. "No," she agreed. "This was Silas Kingston or men paid by him, and I intend to prove it." "You sound very certain for a woman who teaches children their letters." She met his eyes then, weighing how much to say, and decided the moment called for at least a partial truth. "Because teaching children their letters is not the only thing I do, Mr. Carver, and because your bridge is the 3rd piece of Kingston's handiwork I have found in this valley since April." He studied her with new interest, something sharper than the polite indifference he generally showed the world. "Then you had better tell me what you know, Miss Ellsworth, because that bridge is the only crossing for 11 miles in either direction, and my whole herd needs it inside of a week to reach the summer graze on the far bank. Without it, I lose half a season's income, and so does every rancher upstream of here who trades through this canyon." "That," Harriet said, rising and brushing the dust from her skirt, "is precisely the point. Kingston does not want you to lose your herd, Mr. Carver. He wants you desperate enough to sell your land for a fraction of its worth, same as he has done to 4 other families in this valley already. Cut off the bridge, strand the ferry, and a man's whole livelihood becomes a bargaining chip." For a long moment Jasper said nothing at all, only looked out over the broken bridge toward the far canyon wall, gold and rose in the late afternoon light, a country he had known his whole life suddenly looking like a trap closing slow around him. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its wariness and gained something more dangerous, a controlled and steady resolve. "Then I suppose you and I have a great deal of work ahead of us, Miss Ellsworth." "I suppose we do, Mr. Carver." Neither of them smiled, not yet, but something had shifted between them there on the broken bridge, a recognition that whatever wall of polite distance had stood between the reclusive widower and the new schoolteacher was about to come down as surely as the ropes at their feet. That evening in the back room of Amos Fitch's smithy, by the light of a single oil lamp, Harriet finally told Jasper the whole of it, or nearly the whole of it. She told him about the Sentinel, about the tips that had reached her editor Percival Lang concerning suspicious deed transfers throughout 3 counties, about Ezra Doyle's strange silence after his own disappearance and return, about the pattern she had traced through county records during her lunch hours while the children practiced their sums. She did not tell him, not yet, precisely how deep her deception ran, that the schoolhouse position itself had been secured under something less than complete honesty, that the school board believed her only credential was 2 years teaching in Denver, and did not know of the newspaper column that ran under a man's initials. Jasper listened without interrupting, his hat turned over in his hands, and when she finished he was quiet long enough that she began to wonder if she had misjudged him entirely. "My wife Mary used to say," he finally said, "that peace and quiet were the same thing, and that a man who kept to himself could not be touched by the meanness of the world. I believed her for 2 years, Miss Ellsworth. I have been telling myself that solitude was the same as safety. But a bridge my father built with his own 2 hands is lying in pieces in the river, and I find I am no longer interested in being untouched by anything." "I am sorry about your wife," Harriet said, and meant it, though she did not press for more. "She died of a fever the 2nd winter we were married," Jasper said, answering the question she had not asked. "There was nothing anyone could have done," Doc Bennett said as much a dozen times over, "but a man still looks for something to blame, and quiet felt safer than looking too hard at anything else. And now—" He looked up at her, and in the lamplight his eyes were the color of strong coffee, steady and unreadable. "Now I think quiet was never peace at all. It was only waiting." Amos Fitch, who had been pretending very hard not to listen while he banked his forge for the night, cleared his throat loudly enough that both of them startled. "If you 2 are done courting over a torn bridge rope," the blacksmith said, not unkindly, "I would like to know what you intend to do about Silas Kingston before he decides to cut off the ferry crossing too, seeing as that is the only other way in or out of this canyon." Harriet flushed at the word courting but did not correct him, and Jasper only shook his head with the ghost of a smile, the first she had seen cross his face since she had known him. "Amos is right," she said. "We need proof strong enough to bring before a land office registrar and a circuit judge, not just torn ropes and a scrap of paper. We need witnesses willing to speak, and we need it fast, before Kingston finishes what he started." "Then I will handle the trouble outside of town," Jasper said. "There are families further up the canyon who need warning, the Doyles among them, and I doubt Kingston's men will limit themselves to bridges once they know someone is looking too closely. You have a gift for gathering people to a cause, Miss Ellsworth, better than mine by a wide margin. Talk to the town. I will ride the outlying claims." "That sounds like you are giving me the safer job, Mr. Carver." "It sounds like I am giving you the job you are better suited for," he corrected. "Same as I intend to take the one I am better suited for. There is no shame in either, unless you plan to argue with me about it until sundown." She did not argue, though she noted with some private amusement that he had managed to compliment her and win the point in the same breath, a small victory he seemed entirely too pleased with. Over the following days, Harriet Ellsworth built her case the way she had built every story that mattered, one careful conversation at a time. She spoke with Reverend Josiah Whitfield after Sunday service, and found he had quietly kept a ledger of every family in his congregation who had sold land to Kingston's company under circumstances he privately called strange. Families who left within days of selling, always at night, always with more money than the land could possibly have fetched at fair market price, and always refusing to say goodbye to their neighbors. She spoke with Doc Bennett, who confirmed that Ezra Doyle had come to him 3 months prior asking to have a broken finger set, and had refused, white-faced, to explain how the injury occurred, though the doctor had his private suspicions about a man named Boyd Larkin, Kingston's foreman, whose knuckles were forever scraped raw. She spoke with Otis Reed a second time, this time alone, without Tommy Doyle in earshot. And this time the ferryman broke down entirely, admitting through tears that Boyd Larkin had come to him the very night before the bridge was cut, offering $40 and a threat in equal measure. $40 to tell anyone who asked that the bridge failure was natural, and a promise that his ferry license would find trouble with the county the moment the ice broke next winter if he told the truth instead. Harriet wrote it all down in a small cloth-bound notebook she kept hidden beneath the false bottom of her trunk, alongside the torn scrap of Kingston Company letterhead and a growing stack of testimony that would mean nothing in a court of law unless someone with authority was willing to hear it. That was the trouble, of course, and she knew it even as she gathered evidence. Silas Kingston was not merely wealthy. He was respected, a deacon of the very church where Reverend Whitfield preached, a man who had donated the lumber for the schoolhouse roof only 2 years before, whose name appeared on the letterhead of half the county's civic committees. To accuse him of fraud without ironclad proof was to invite ruin, not upon him, but upon herself and everyone who dared stand beside her. Jasper Carver's work outside of town proved no gentler. He rode first to the Doyle homestead, where he found Ezra Doyle mending a fence with hands that shook slightly whenever a rider passed on the road beyond his property line, and convinced the man, over the course of a long afternoon and 2 cups of chicory coffee, to write down in his own hand exactly what had happened to him 3 months prior. Ezra had been taken at gunpoint from his own barn, driven blindfolded into the hills, and told in no uncertain terms that his signature on a deed transfer would arrive one way or another, either freely given or beaten out of him. He had signed nothing that day, but the threat had never left him. From the Doyle place, Jasper rode further north to the Alvarez Ranch, where he arrived just in time to find Boyd Larkin and 2 other riders attempting to drive off a portion of the family's cattle, under the pretense of a boundary dispute that existed nowhere in any survey Jasper had ever seen filed. He did not draw his pistol, though his hand rested near it the entire time, and he did not raise his voice, though every word carried the flat certainty of a man who had made up his mind about something important. "Those cattle carry the Alvarez brand," Jasper said, walking his horse calmly between the disputed herd and Larkin's men. "I have known that brand since I was a boy, same as I have known this whole valley since before your employer ever set foot in it. You will turn those cattle back where they came from, or I will ride to the county sheriff myself and swear out a complaint of cattle theft, and we will let a judge sort out whose boundary is whose." Larkin, a broad man with a scar bisecting one eyebrow, spat into the dust and studied Jasper for a long moment, clearly weighing whether the widower's reputation for quiet was a weakness worth testing. Something in Jasper's steady gaze must have convinced him otherwise, for he finally jerked his chin at his men, and the 3 of them rode off without the cattle, though not without a parting threat. "Carver, you would do well to remember you have got a bridge that needs rebuilding and a lot of empty acres between your house and your nearest neighbor. Things happen to lonely men out here. Ask anybody." "They do," Jasper agreed evenly, "and I have buried a wife already, Larkin, so you will find I am considerably harder to frighten than I once was. Tell Kingston I said so." He rode home that night with his nerves drawn tight as fence wire and found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, wishing Harriet Ellsworth were there to hear how the confrontation had gone, wishing for the particular clarity of her attention, the way she listened to a story and immediately found the one detail that mattered most. He told himself this was only because she was gathering evidence and needed a full account, and mostly believed it. It was 2 nights later that they found themselves keeping watch together for the first time, in the small back room of the schoolhouse, where Harriet had begun storing her growing collection of testimony and evidence, fearful after Otis Reed's confession that Kingston's men might come looking to destroy what could not be unsigned or unsaid. Jasper had offered to stand guard, and Harriet, recognizing both the sense and the courtesy in the offer, had not refused, though she insisted on sharing the watch rather than being protected from it, an insistence that seemed to please him more than it should have. They sat on opposite sides of a small table by lamplight, a shotgun Harriet had borrowed from Amos Fitch propped within easy reach, the schoolhouse silent around them except for the tick of a clock and the distant call of a nightjar somewhere along the canyon rim. "You never did finish telling me everything," Jasper said, some hours into the quiet, when the lamp had burned low and the ordinary reserve between them had softened into something closer to companionship. "About the newspaper. About why a woman with a byline in a Denver paper takes a post teaching children their sums in a canyon most maps do not bother naming." Harriet considered how much of herself to give him and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted to give him all of it. "My father was a land agent in Missouri," she said. "A good one, honest, the kind who told a family the truth about a parcel even when a lie would have made him more money. A company very like Kingston's ruined him when I was 16, forged a survey that made his honest dealings look like fraud, took everything he had built in 20 years and left him with nothing but his name dragged through every paper in the county. He never recovered his reputation before he died. I decided somewhere in all that grief that I would spend my life making sure men like that could not hide behind respectability forever. And the schoolteacher part. That part is real too," she said, softer now. "I do love the children, Mr. Carver, more than I expected to when I took the post as a means to an end. I did not lie about caring for them, only about why I first walked through that door." Jasper turned his hat over in his hands, a habit she had come to recognize as his version of choosing words carefully. "Mary and I never had children," he said. "We meant to, in time. I think that is part of why the quiet after she died felt so complete, so absolute. There was no small voice to fill it, nothing left in the house but my own footsteps and the wind. I told myself I preferred it that way because the alternative was admitting how much I missed the sound of another person simply existing nearby." "And now?" Harriet asked, echoing the question he had once asked her, though gentler this time. "Now the sound of you arguing with a torn bridge rope is the most interesting thing that has happened to me in 2 years, he said, and there was real warmth beneath the dry humor, "and I find I am in no hurry for the quiet to come back." She laughed, low and surprised, and something in the small sound seemed to loosen a knot behind his ribs that had been drawn tight since Mary's funeral. They did not speak of love that night, nor even come particularly close to it in words. But when the lamp finally guttered out near dawn, and they sat together in the gray half-light waiting for the schoolhouse to wake around them, Harriet found she did not mind the closeness of him at all, and Jasper found himself in no hurry to move away. That fragile new trust met its first true test only 4 days later, and it came from a direction neither of them expected. Harriet had traveled to Gunnison to send a telegram to her editor, Percival Lang, requesting he wire word to the Territorial Land Office and inquire when a circuit judge might next pass through the county. And while there, she had also posted a brief, carefully worded letter under her own byline describing suspicious land transfers in Sable Canyon, intending it only as a way of putting the story on record in case anything happened to her personal notes. She had not anticipated that a copy of the Sentinel carrying an early version of that column, printed by a hasty junior editor eager for a scoop, would reach Sable Canyon before she herself returned, nor that Silas Kingston kept a standing subscription to every paper in the territory that might mention his interests. She rode back into town at dusk to find a crowd gathered outside the general store, and Kingston himself standing on the raised boardwalk above them, a folded newspaper in one gloved hand, his voice carrying with the practiced boom of a man accustomed to being believed. "Friends," he was saying as she reined in, "I have here a column written by one H.E. Wells of the Rocky Mountain Sentinel, making the most scurrilous accusations against my company, against my character, and against the good order of this valley. And I have it on excellent authority that H.E. Wells is no man at all, but a woman living among us under false pretenses, drawing a schoolteacher's salary from this very town while secretly plotting against its most generous benefactor. Harriet felt the color drain from her face as every eye in the crowd turned toward her, and she understood in that single terrible moment that Kingston had somehow learned her secret and chosen the most public possible stage on which to reveal it. "Miss Ellsworth," Kingston said, turning his gaze upon her with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "would you care to deny it, in front of the very school board that trusted you with their children?" She could have denied it. She could have lied, bought herself time, and she saw in his expression that he expected exactly that, expected her to crumble under public exposure the way frightened women in his experience always had. Instead, she dismounted slowly, straightened her shawl, and walked to the base of the boardwalk with her chin high. "I will not deny it, Mr. Kingston, because it is true. I am a journalist, and I came to this valley because reports reached my editor of forged deeds, threatened families, and a pattern of intimidation stretching across 3 counties, all leading back to your company. I did not lie about my ability to teach these children, nor about my care for them, and every parent here is welcome to judge that for themselves. But I will not apologize for seeking the truth about a man who cuts down 40-year-old bridges in the dead of night and pays desperate men to lie about it afterward." A ripple went through the crowd, murmurs of surprise, and here and there something that might have been admiration, but Kingston only laughed, a short humorless sound. "Bold words from a woman about to lose her position, I should think. The school board answers to the town council, Miss Ellsworth, and I believe I have some small influence there." It was in this moment, with the crowd's attention fixed entirely upon Kingston and Harriet, that Jasper Carver rode up the street at a trot, having heard the commotion from 2 blocks distant, and swung down from his horse near enough to hear the tail end of the exchange. Harriet caught his eye for only a moment before he looked away, and something in his expression, some flicker of hurt beneath the controlled surface, told her he had heard enough to understand that she had kept the full truth even from him. That evening, after the crowd dispersed and the school board had adjourned an emergency meeting without reaching a decision, Jasper found her sitting alone on the schoolhouse steps, her knees drawn up, her earlier composure entirely spent. "You might have told me," he said, not unkindly, but with a weariness that cut deeper than anger would have. "I told you about Mary. I told you things I have not said aloud to another living soul in 2 years, and you let me believe I knew the whole of your reasons for being here." "I did tell you the truth, Jasper," she said, using his given name for the first time, and noting the small, startled flicker in his eyes when she did. "I told you about the paper, about my father, about why I care so much about men like Kingston. I only left out the smallest detail, the byline itself, because the fewer people who knew precisely which words in that paper were mine, the fewer chances Kingston had of learning it before I was ready. And you did not think I could be trusted with that detail. I thought," she said, her voice catching, "that the moment you knew a printed accusation existed with my name attached, however hidden, you would feel obligated to protect me from the consequences of it. And I did not want you carrying that weight on top of everything else Kingston has already threatened you with. I have watched men decide women need protecting instead of partnering my whole life, Jasper, and I did not want that from you. I wanted a partner. I still do." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the darkening canyon, and when he finally spoke, his voice had softened considerably. "I have spent 2 years telling myself I wanted nothing more than quiet, Harriet, and here I find the one thing that draws me out of it is a woman who keeps her own counsel every bit as stubbornly as I keep mine. I suppose I cannot fault you for a habit I share. Does that mean you forgive me?" "It means," he said, sitting down beside her on the step, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, "that I understand you, which I think may be a rarer thing than forgiveness. But I would ask one thing of you going forward if we are to see this fight through together. Name it. No more secrets kept out of kindness. Whatever comes, we face it with the whole truth between us, even when the truth is hard to say." "Agreed," she said, and held out her hand, and he took it, and they sat together in the gathering dark. The fragile trust between them bent but not broken, stronger perhaps, for having survived its first real test. But Silas Kingston was not a man to let a single public setback end a scheme worth thousands of dollars. And within the week, his true intentions became clear in a manner far more dangerous than any newspaper column or bridge sabotage had been. It happened on a Saturday, during the valley's late summer harvest gathering, when nearly every family within 10 miles had come into Sable Canyon for the shared thrashing, and the dance that traditionally followed it. Wagons and livestock crowded along the main street and the fairground beyond the church. Harriet had been helping Reverend Whitfield's wife arrange tables of food when she heard, distant at first and then rapidly growing, a low rumbling thunder rolling down from the northern pastures, and beneath it, unmistakable even at a distance, the panicked bawling of cattle running at a dead stampede. "That is Kingston's herd," Jasper said, appearing at her side so suddenly she startled, his face already grim with understanding. "He has been holding 200 head in the north pasture above the fairground all week, claiming he needed grazing rights he does not legally possess. Someone has spooked them, or driven them deliberately, and they are running straight for the crossroads where half this valley is standing right now." There was no time for further discussion. Jasper was already running for his horse, and Harriet, without a moment's hesitation, gathered her skirts and ran for hers as well, a sturdy chestnut mare she had learned to ride with more competence than most in town realized, thanks to childhood summers spent on her uncle's farm in Missouri. "Harriet, this is not a schoolroom," Jasper called as she swung up into the saddle beside him. "This is 200 head of panicked longhorn running blind, and I cannot watch out for you and turn that herd both." "Then do not watch out for me," she shouted back over the rising thunder of hooves, "and turn the herd. I can ride, Jasper Carver, and I am not leaving this to you alone while children are standing in that crossroads." He had no time to argue further, and something in him, some part that had spent 2 years believing he must face every danger in solitude, recognized in that instant that he did not want to face this one alone regardless, that having her beside him made the danger feel survivable rather than merely bearable. They rode hard for the northern approach to the crossroads, cutting across a fallow field to gain ground on the stampeding herd's flank, the ground shaking beneath them as the dust cloud of the running cattle came into view, a churning brown wave crashing down the narrow canyon road with the fairground and its terrified crowd directly in its path. "We cannot stop 200 head head-on," Jasper shouted. "We have to turn the leaders, same as working a herd on a drive, get ahead of the point riders and bend them east toward the river flats before they reach the crossroads. Tell me what to do. Ride for the lead steer, the big brindle one out front. Fire your rifle into the air on his left flank when I signal, and I will come up on his right with the rope. If we can turn him, the rest will follow same as they always do." They rode flat out along the field's edge, gaining on the churning mass of terrified animals until they drew nearly parallel with the lead steer, a massive brindle longhorn with wild rolling eyes and foam at its mouth. Harriet drew the borrowed rifle from her saddle scabbard, checked her seat, and at Jasper's shouted signal fired a single shot skyward on the animal's left side, while Jasper spurred his gelding into a full gallop on the right, uncoiling his lariat in the same motion. The steer, startled by the gunshot and hemmed by the horse pressing close on its right flank, swung its great head left and began, agonizingly slow at first, and then with sudden commitment, to bend its course away from the crossroads and toward the open river flats beyond. The herd behind it, following the ancient instinct of cattle to trust the animal ahead of them, began to bend as well, a great brown river of muscle and horn curving in a new direction like water finding a lower course. It was not over in an instant. For nearly a quarter-mile Harriet and Jasper rode alongside the turning herd, Harriet firing occasional warning shots to keep the flank animals from breaking back toward town, Jasper working his rope and his voice, and the sheer pressure of his horse's presence to keep the leaders committed to their new direction, both of them coated in dust and deafened by the thunder of hooves, until at last the herd streamed harmlessly out onto the open flats above the river, slowing gradually from panicked run to exhausted trot as the immediate terror that had driven them began to fade. They pulled up their winded horses at the edge of the flats, chests heaving nearly as hard as their mounts, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, only stared at each other through the settling dust with something between disbelief and exhilaration. "You are a fair hand with a rifle, Miss Ellsworth," Jasper finally managed, "for a schoolteacher." "You are a fair hand with a rope, Mr. Carver," she returned, "for a man who claims to prefer solitude." He laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, the sound of it doing something strange and pleasant to her chest, and before either of them quite decided to do it, he had reached across the space between their horses and taken her hand, dust and all, and pressed it briefly to his lips. "That was Kingston's doing," he said, more seriously now. "No natural stampede starts that clean, that sudden, aimed square at a crowd of families on a Saturday afternoon. Someone drove those cattle on purpose." They found the proof of it within the hour, when Amos Fitch and two other men, riding out to check the north pasture once the danger had passed, discovered a set of fresh hoof prints belonging to at least 3 riders, positioned exactly where a herd might be startled into a run toward the crossroads, along with a torn fragment of black coat fabric caught on the pasture fence. Fabric that matched precisely the description of coats worn by Boyd Larkin's riders. It was a near thing, everyone agreed later, entirely too near, and the fury that swept through the gathered families that evening, once they understood how close their children had come to being trampled in the street, proved to be the single greatest gift Harriet's investigation could have received. Fear of Kingston curdled overnight into anger at him, and anger, Harriet knew from long experience, made witnesses brave in ways that fear alone never could. That night Jasper again shared the watch with her at the schoolhouse, though this time the atmosphere between them had changed entirely, charged with something neither of them tried very hard to disguise. They sat closer together at the small table than they had before, and when Harriet's hand trembled slightly, delayed reaction to the afternoon's danger finally catching up with her, Jasper reached over without a word and simply held it, his thumb tracing slow circles against her knuckles. "I have been thinking," he said quietly, "about what you said the night we first sat watch together, about wanting a partner instead of protection. And I find I no longer know how to separate the two where you are concerned. I want to protect you, Harriet, fiercely, more than I have wanted anything since Mary died. But I also trust you to ride into a stampede beside me and turn a herd better than most cowhands I have known. I do not think those two things need to be at odds." "They are not," she said softly, turning her hand in his to lace their fingers together. "A partner protects too, Jasper. That is not weakness in either of us. It is only love if we are honest about calling it that. Are we being honest about calling it that?" "I think we had better be," she said, "given everything else we have promised to be honest about." He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every opportunity to draw back if she wished, and when she did not, he kissed her there in the lamplight of the schoolhouse, gentle at first, and then with a growing certainty that seemed to settle something long unsettled in both of them. When at last they parted, her forehead resting against his, she felt his breath catch slightly, and understood that for a man who had spent 2 years convincing himself he wanted nothing more from life, this moment carried the weight of an ending and a beginning both. "I am not sorry for any of my secrets," she murmured, "except the ones that cost us even a single evening of this." "Then let us waste no more of them," Jasper said, and kissed her again. The days that followed moved with the particular swiftness of a story approaching its reckoning. Word had reached Gunnison of the stampede and the growing scandal surrounding Kingston's dealings, and Percival Lang, sensing the biggest story of his editorial career, arranged for a circuit judge, the Honorable Elias Thorne, to extend his usual route to include Sable Canyon, along with a registrar from the Territorial Land Office, Mr. Cornelius Wade, whose task it would be to examine the disputed deeds against the original survey records held in Denver. Harriet spent those days assembling every thread of evidence into a coherent whole, sitting late into the night at Amos Fitch's kitchen table with Reverend Whitfield, Doc Bennett, and Ezra Doyle, organizing sworn statements, the torn Kingston Company letterhead, Otis Reed's confession, and a final crucial piece of evidence that arrived almost by accident, when a former clerk of Kingston's company, a nervous young man named Winslow Pratt, who had fled the company's employ in a fit of conscience after the stampede nearly killed a child he had grown fond of, appeared at the schoolhouse door one evening with a satchel full of original ledgers, showing exactly how the forged deeds had been manufactured, tracing false chains of title back through a genuine but long-expired Spanish land grant that Kingston's lawyers had exploited to cast doubt on dozens of legitimate homestead claims throughout the valley, including, Harriet discovered with a start, her own 160-acre claim filed quietly upon her arrival months before, land she had staked partly as further cover for her investigation, and partly, she admitted to herself now, because some part of her had already begun imagining a future in this canyon that had nothing to do with newspapers at all. Jasper, meanwhile, rode the valley warning every affected family of the coming hearing and gathering their willingness to testify, and found, to his quiet satisfaction, that the fear which had kept so many silent for so long dissolved rapidly once neighbors saw other neighbors willing to stand up first. Ezra Doyle agreed to testify about his abduction. The Alvarez family agreed to testify about the attempted cattle theft. A dozen smaller families came forward with stories of intimidation, threats, and deeds signed under duress, each account adding weight to the mounting case against Kingston Land and Cattle Company. Silas Kingston, for his part, did not remain idle. He attempted first to have the judge's visit postponed on a legal technicality, and when that failed, he attempted to buy Winslow Pratt's silence with an offer of $500, an offer the young clerk refused, having already given his statement in writing to 3 separate witnesses. Finally, 2 days before the scheduled hearing, Kingston sent Boyd Larkin to the schoolhouse under cover of darkness, with instructions to retrieve or destroy whatever evidence Harriet had gathered, an attempt that failed only because Jasper, anticipating exactly such a move, had taken to sleeping in the small storage room behind the schoolhouse with his rifle close at hand. He woke to the sound of a window latch being forced, and by the time Larkin had climbed halfway through the frame, Jasper stood waiting in the darkness with his rifle leveled and steady. "I would think carefully about your next move, Larkin," Jasper said quietly. "There is a judge arriving in 2 days. An attempted burglary added to fraud and attempted murder by stampede will not improve your employer's position with him in the slightest." Larkin froze halfway through the window, weighing his odds in the dark, and something in Jasper's flat certain voice must have convinced him the odds were poor indeed, for he withdrew slowly, hands raised, and disappeared into the night without another word. Jasper did not sleep again that night, but he did not need to. Dawn brought with it the day before the hearing, and with it, an unshakable sense that the long fight was very nearly won. The hearing itself was held in the town hall, the only building in Sable Canyon large enough to contain the crowd that gathered. Nearly every family in the valley pressed shoulder to shoulder along the walls and crowded onto borrowed benches, drawn by equal parts fear, hope, and the simple human hunger to see justice done in the open rather than whispered about in kitchens after dark. Judge Elias Thorne, A lean, silver-haired man with the patient bearing of someone who had presided over 100 such disputes across a dozen counties, sat behind a table at the front of the room, alongside Cornelius Wade of the Land Office, a stack of ledgers, deeds, and survey maps arranged between them. Silas Kingston arrived dressed in his finest black suit, flanked by 2 lawyers he had brought up from Denver at considerable expense, his composure so complete that for a moment Harriet felt a flicker of the old fear, the sense that respectability itself might prove an armor too thick to pierce. But when Judge Thorne called the proceedings to order and invited any party with evidence bearing on the disputed land claims to come forward, Harriet Ellsworth rose from her seat without a moment's hesitation. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying clear and steady through the crowded hall, "my name is Harriet Ellsworth. I am the schoolteacher of this town, and I am also a journalist, writing under the byline H.E. Wells for the Rocky Mountain Sentinel. I came to Sable Canyon 4 months ago because credible reports reached my editor that the Kingston Land and Cattle Company was systematically defrauding homesteaders throughout this valley, using a long-expired Spanish land grant to cast false doubt on legitimate claims, and using intimidation, threat, and outright violence to force families to sell land at a fraction of its worth." A murmur rolled through the crowd, and Kingston's lawyers rose in immediate objection, but Judge Thorne raised a single hand for silence. "I have read Miss Ellsworth's correspondence with the Land Office myself," he said, "and I have reviewed preliminary documents provided by Mr. Wade. I am inclined to hear her evidence in full before entertaining objections. Counselor, proceed, Miss Ellsworth." What followed was the most complete telling Harriet had yet given, laid out with the same clarity and precision she had once brought to every newsroom story she had ever filed. She presented the torn Kingston Company letterhead recovered from the sabotaged bridge. She called Otis Reed to testify to the bribe and threat that had led him to lie about the bridge's destruction, and watched the ferryman, visibly trembling but resolute, confirm every word under the judge's careful questioning. She called Ezra Doyle, who described his abduction and the threats made against his family in a voice that grew steadier with every sentence, as though the act of speaking the truth aloud, finally, in front of witnesses, was itself a kind of healing. She called Winslow Pratt, whose ledgers, cross-referenced against the county survey records Cornelius Wade had brought from Denver, demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that the chains of title Kingston's company had presented were fabricated, built atop a Spanish grant that had legally expired decades before any of the disputed homesteads were ever filed. Finally, she called Jasper Carver, who described in plain, unadorned words the deliberate destruction of his father's bridge, the confrontation with Boyd Larkin over the stolen Alvarez cattle, and the attempted break-in at the schoolhouse only 2 nights prior, an account that drew audible gasps from the crowd when he described finding Larkin halfway through the window with clear intent to destroy the very evidence now laid before the court. Through all of it, Kingston sat rigid and pale, his lawyers scrambling to mount objections that Judge Thorne repeatedly overruled on grounds of relevance and established fact. When Harriet finally finished, laying the last of Winslow Pratt's ledgers upon the table before the judge, she turned to face Kingston directly for the first time since the hearing began. "Mr. Kingston," she said, her voice ringing clear through the silent hall, "you called me a liar and a fraud in front of this whole town not 3 weeks ago, standing on that boardwalk with your newspaper in hand, certain that exposing my secret would end my investigation and my career both. I told you then that I would not apologize for seeking the truth about a man who cuts down bridges and terrorizes families to line his own pockets. I tell you the same now, before this judge and every witness in this hall. Whatever claim I hold on this valley, I have earned honestly, same as every family you have tried to cheat out of theirs, and I am not leaving until every one of them has justice." For a long moment the town hall was utterly silent, And then Silas Kingston, his composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence too complete to dismiss, rose from his chair with sudden violence, his hand moving toward the pocket of his coat where, it would later be confirmed, he kept a small pistol. "You have ruined everything," he snarled, all pretense of respectability gone from his voice. 20 years I have built this company, and I will not have it destroyed by a schoolteacher and a grieving widower playing at heroics." Jasper Carver moved before the pistol had fully cleared Kingston's pocket, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides, and pinning the land baron's wrist against the table with a grip that left no room for argument, while Amos Fitch and 2 other men rushed forward to seize Kingston's other arm. And within moments the pistol had been wrestled away and set safely out of reach on the judge's table, the whole struggle over almost as quickly as it began. "That," Judge Thorne said into the stunned silence that followed, his voice dry as old paper, "is generally considered a poor way to conduct oneself before a court of law, Mr. Kingston, and does very little to help your case." He gestured to the town's newly appointed constable, a role filled since the previous month by a steady young man named Caleb Rourke, who stepped forward to place Kingston formally under arrest on charges of fraud, assault, attempted destruction of property, and now, attempted assault upon an officer of the court. "I will render my full findings in writing within the week," the judge continued, "but I see no reason to delay the essential conclusion any further. Every deed transfer in this valley conducted under the authority of the expired Spanish land grant is hereby voided as fraudulent. Every family who sold land under threat or intimidation is entitled to reclaim their homestead or seek fair restitution through this court. And Miss Ellsworth's own claim, which Mr. Wade's records confirm was filed properly and in good faith, stands confirmed and clear of any cloud cast upon it by this company's fraudulent dealings." A great sound went up through the crowded hall then, something between a cheer and a collective exhale of breath held far too long, as neighbors turned to embrace one another, and Ezra Doyle wept openly with his son Tommy held tight against his side, and Reverend Whitfield began, quite without meaning to, a spontaneous hymn of thanksgiving that half the hall joined before it finished the first verse. Harriet stood very still in the midst of the celebration, watching as Constable Rourke led a subdued and silent Silas Kingston from the hall to await transport to the territorial prison in Denver, and felt the enormous weight of 4-month secrecy and fear lift from her shoulders all at once, so suddenly that her knees very nearly buckled beneath her. It was Jasper who caught her, his arm coming around her waist as naturally as breathing, steadying her against him amid the joyful chaos of the hall. "You did it," he murmured against her hair. "You faced him down in front of the whole valley and you won." "We did it," she corrected, turning in his arms to look up at him. "I could never have gathered enough to matter without you riding every claim in this canyon, without you standing between Larkin and that window, without you catching a pistol before it ever cleared a coat pocket. Perhaps," he allowed, "we simply make a fair partnership, Miss Ellsworth." "I think," she said, smiling now, the last of the tension finally draining from her shoulders, "that we make considerably more than a fair partnership, Mr. Carver, if you are asking my professional opinion as a journalist." "I am asking something else entirely, actually," he said, and to her considerable surprise, and the delighted gasps of at least a dozen nearby witnesses who had turned to watch, he lowered himself onto one knee right there amid the scattered benches and lingering celebration of the town hall. "I have spent 2 years telling myself that solitude was peace," he said, his voice carrying only for her though half the town strained to hear it anyway, "and you have spent 4 months proving to me, and to this entire valley, that the truest peace comes from having someone worth fighting beside. I do not want to go back to that quiet, Harriet. I do not want to face one more sunrise without knowing you will be there to greet it with me. Will you marry me?" The town hall, which had already been loud with celebration, erupted now into something closer to joyous pandemonium, and Harriet, laughing through sudden tears, pulled Jasper up from his knee, and kissed him soundly in front of the entire assembled valley, before she even managed to say the word yes aloud. Though say it she eventually did, to renewed cheering that Reverend Whitfield later claimed could be heard clear across the canyon. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a warm, golden Sunday afternoon, when the last of summer still lingered sweet in the cottonwoods along the Sable River, and the entire valley turned out to celebrate in a manner that made clear how thoroughly the community had healed in the short time since Kingston's arrest. The rebuilt bridge at Carver Crossing, finished just 2 days prior through the combined labor of nearly every able-bodied man and woman in the canyon, stood strung with wildflower garlands for the occasion, its new planks pale and fresh against the weathered stone of the canyon walls. A fitting symbol, Reverend Whitfield observed in his ceremony, of a community that had rebuilt far more than a single crossing over the preceding months. Harriet wore a simple dress of cream-colored muslin, sewn with the help of half the women in town who had insisted on contributing lace and ribbon, and no small amount of good-natured advice. And she walked not down a church aisle, but across the very bridge her husband-to-be had helped rebuild, escorted not by a father long since passed, but by Ezra Doyle, who had asked for the honor himself. His son Tommy walking proudly ahead of them, scattering wildflower petals, with the solemn dedication of a boy who understood, in his own way, that he owed this happy day in part to the schoolteacher, who had never once dismissed his frightened account on that terrible afternoon months before. Jasper waited for her on the far bank, dressed in a dark suit that Amos Fitch had helped him select on a rare trip to Gunnison, his hands, she noticed with tender amusement, betraying the same nervous habit of turning over a hat he no longer held, empty fingers seeking something to occupy them, until she finally reached his side and took both his hands in hers instead. Reverend Whitfield spoke of second chances, of quiet mistaken for peace and courage mistaken for recklessness, of a valley that had very nearly lost itself to greed and fear before 2 stubborn hearts had refused to let it. He spoke of Mary Carver with gentle honesty, acknowledging that love did not require forgetting what came before, only room enough to grow alongside it, and Harriet saw Jasper's eyes glisten at the words, saw him glance skyward for just a moment as though in quiet acknowledgement and farewell both, before he returned his full attention to her, with a look of such open devotion that she felt her own eyes fill in answer. When at last they exchanged their vows, Harriet found herself speaking not the formal words she had half expected to stumble over, but something truer, something that rose up unbidden from everything the past months had taught her. "I came to this valley looking for a story," she said, her voice carrying clear across the gathered crowd on the riverbank, "and I found instead a home, and a fight worth having, and a man brave enough to stand beside me in both. Jasper Carver, I promise to keep no more secrets from you than kindness ever requires, to ride beside you into whatever trouble finds us, and to love you as fiercely as you have loved this valley and everyone in it, for as long as we both shall live." Jasper's vow, when it came, was shorter, but no less complete. "I spent 2 years believing that solitude was the safest thing a grieving man could choose," he said, his voice thick with feeling he made no attempt to hide. "You taught me that safety was never the point, Harriet, that a life worth living asks to be shared, danger and all. I promise to build with you whatever this valley still needs building, to protect what is yours as fiercely as my own, and to never again mistake quiet for peace when I could have your voice beside me instead." The kiss that sealed their vows drew the loudest cheer the canyon had heard since the day the fraudulent deeds were voided, and the celebration that followed lasted well past sundown. Tables of food spread the length of the rebuilt bridge itself, fiddle music drifting up the canyon walls, children racing across the new planks in games of tag, while their parents danced beneath lanterns strung from post to post. Ezra Doyle danced with his wife for the first time in months without a shadow of fear crossing his face. Otis Reed, restored to good standing and good conscience both, ran the ferry for free the whole evening for anyone wishing to cross and admire the view from the water. Even Winslow Pratt, the nervous young clerk whose courage had helped seal Kingston's downfall, found himself welcomed warmly into the celebration, offered a position by Amos Fitch as an apprentice, a fresh start in a valley that had learned, this summer, exactly how much a single honest voice could accomplish against even the most entrenched deceit. Late in the evening, when the dancing had slowed and the youngest children had fallen asleep against their parents' shoulders, Harriet and Jasper slipped away from the celebration to stand alone at the center of the rebuilt bridge, looking out over the dark water silvered by rising moonlight, the sounds of the party soft and warm behind them. "Your father would be proud of this bridge," Harriet said softly, resting her head against her husband's shoulder. "Proud of what it carried across it today. He would be prouder still of who is standing beside me on it," Jasper answered, wrapping his arm around her. "Though I suspect he would tell me I took entirely too long working up the nerve to ask you." 2 years of solitude and 4 months of stubbornness," Harriet said, laughing softly. "I would say that is fairly efficient for a man who claims to prefer quiet." "I no longer claim any such thing," Jasper said, turning her gently to face him in the moonlight. "I have found something considerably better than quiet, Mrs. Carver, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I know the difference now." "Mrs. Carver," Harriet repeated, testing the sound of it against the memory of every name she had worn before, journalist, schoolteacher, H.E. Wells, and finding that this one, spoken in his voice beneath a canyon sky full of stars, fit more comfortably than any of them ever had. "I could grow rather fond of that name, Mr. Carver." "Good," he said, and kissed her again, unhurried and certain. There on the bridge his father had built and he had rebuilt, in the valley she had come to save and stayed to love, while behind them the whole of Sable Canyon celebrated late into the golden summer night. A community made whole again, a claim won and a heart won alongside it, and a love story that both of them understood, standing together in that moonlit quiet at last, was only just beginning.